Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 15. As the liberating forces came in, and the Germans hurriedly withdrew, Rome was little short of a madhouse. Hundreds of prisoners held by the Germans and neo-fascist secret police were murdered in their cells, and helpless civilians were murdered as hostages or in reprisal by the retreating German forces. Guerrilla bands behind the German lines performed good services to the Allied cause, harassing communications, assisting Allied intelligence, and helping escaping prisoners. Many of these guerrillas were fighting for social revolution, as well as for the liberation of Italy, and there was a good deal of rivalry and even of violent conflict among them. The dominant influence was that of the communists, who were more highly disciplined and more closely controlled than the non-communist units. The fall of Mussolini gave a considerable impetus to post-war planning within the Allied camps. There had been a certain amount of this during the dark days from 1939 to 1943. But on the whole, the Allied leaders were reluctant to commit themselves to any projects which might restrict their freedom of action in conducting the war or in manipulating its diplomatic and propagandist background. The collapse of one of the enemy states, however, made it necessary to devote some serious attention to post-war plans. At the same time, experiences in Italy showed that the problems of the post-war era would be much broader than merely political or diplomatic, and would include social, economic, and ideological problems on a scale never experienced previously. It was clear that the poverty, confusion, and human suffering found by our advancing armies in Italy would be increased tenfold when the much more bitter resistance of Germany had been overcome. In order to avoid any repetition of the widespread Allied deals with Darlan and other Vichyites, the occupied areas of Italy were subjected to a completely military Allied government. Although, to obtain legal continuity and legal justification for this government, the various agreements were signed by Badoglio. Even this small amount of contact with ex-fascist leaders aroused adverse comment in certain circles in the United States. Although, at the same time, and usually in the same circles, there was objection to the use of a purely military administration as an alternative. The only other possibility would have been to turn the newly liberated areas over to the local anti-fascist native groups. This last solution was out of the question, for these groups were generally so determined on social and economic revolution that they would have created conflicts and disturbances which would have jeopardized the position of our armies of occupation, and would certainly have increased the social and economic problems which most Americans were eager to reduce. These social and economic problems were mostly of a very practical nature, and were concerned with starvation, disease, public order, and the care of displaced persons. All these problems were drastically increased by the ruthless destructiveness of the German forces as they withdrew toward Germany itself. Food supplies were taken away or were destroyed. Millions were left homeless, many of them far from their homes and in pitiful conditions of semi-starvation and disease. These conditions, which became steadily worse as the war drew to its close, made a great appeal to the humanitarian feelings of Americans, and presented problems with which American generosity and organizational efficiency were well able to deal. On the other hand, Americans had weak political interests and narrow ideological training, and were eager to avoid problems such as forms of government, patterns of property distribution, or nationalistic disputes. It is, then, not surprising that American post-war planning and the behavior of American administrators neglected the latter kinds of problems to devote their energies to the more practical tasks of material survival. On the political, legal, or ideological problems, the American liberators had little to offer beyond rather vague and idealistic praise of democracy, private ownership, and freedom. While the military efforts of the Anglo-Americans were in full public view, passing from victory to victory in the early months of 1943, a very ominous situation had arisen behind the scenes in respect to their relations with the Soviet Union. We have already mentioned the evidence that quite incompatible decisions about the post-war world had been made in Washington and Moscow at this time. The decision in Washington seems to have been that every effort would be made, through wartime concessions to the Soviet Union, to obtain Russian cooperation in a post-war international organization, and that all territorial problems should be left to the post-war period. The decision in Moscow seems to have been that the Anglo-American powers could not be trusted, and that the Soviet Union must seek to ensure its post-war security by creation of a series of satellite and buffer states on its western frontier. The incompatibility of these points of view gave rise to the Polish crisis of May 1943. After the Nazi-Soviet division of Poland in September 1939, a Polish government in exile was established in France and later in London, with General Władysław Sikorski as prime minister. This government, although recognized as the successor to the defeated Polish government by most of the world, was not recognized by the Axis powers or by the Soviet Union. These pretended that Poland had ceased to exist. Russia, which had received half of Poland, with 13.2 million of Poland's 35 million inhabitants, incorporated these areas into the Soviet Union, imposing Soviet citizenship on the inhabitants, and forced over 1 million of them to go to other parts of Russia to work in mines, in factories, or on farms. Most educated or professional persons among the Poles were arrested and put into concentration camps with the captured officers of the Polish armies. In the meantime, the portions of Poland taken by Germany had been divided into two parts, of which the western, with 10.5 million inhabitants, was incorporated into Germany, and the rest, with 11.5 million inhabitants, and including Warsaw, was organized as the Government General of Poland under German administration. The Nazis sought to force all ethnic Poles into the Government General, to exterminate, either directly or through the exhaustion and malnutrition of slave labor, all the educated elements among the Polish people, and to murder without compunction the country's large Jewish population. The German attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, led to a brief reversal of the Kremlin's attitude toward Poland. In an apparent effort to obtain Polish support in the struggle with Germany, the Soviet Union re-established diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile in London, and signed an agreement on July 30, 1941, by which the Soviet-German partition treaties of 1939 were cancelled. A general amnesty was granted Polish citizens imprisoned in the Soviet Union, and General Władysław Anders was allowed to organize a new Polish army from the Poles in the Soviet Union. Efforts to create this army were hampered by the fact that about 10,000 Polish officers, along with about 5,000 Polish intellectuals and professional persons, all of whom had been held in 3 camps in western Russia, could not be found. In addition, at least 100,000 Polish prisoners of war, out of the 230,000 captured by Soviet forces in September 1939, had been exterminated in Soviet labor camps from starvation and overwork, and over 1 million Polish civilians were being similarly treated. Constant obstacles were offered by the Soviet authorities to the efforts of General Anders to reconstruct a Polish army in the East. When rations were cut to 26,000 to feed a force of 70,000 soldiers and many thousands of Polish civilian refugees, Anders obtained permission to evacuate his force to Iran, March 1942. It was this group which fought so well the following years in Italy and in Western Europe. As soon as Anders' forces left Russia, the Soviet leaders began to organize a group of Polish and Russian communists into a so-called Union of Polish Patriots, which sponsored a Polish-language radio station and a new communist-controlled Polish army in Russia. In January 1943, Moscow informed the Sikorsky government in London that all Poles originating from the provinces occupied by Soviet forces in September 1939 would be regarded as Soviet subjects. While Soviet-Polish relations were deteriorating, the German radio suddenly announced on April 13, 1943, that German forces in occupied Russia had discovered, at Katnya, near Smolensk, Russia, mass graves containing the bodies of 5,000 Polish officers who had been murdered by the Soviet authorities in the spring of 1940. Moscow called this a Nazi propaganda trick and declared that the Polish officers had been murdered and buried by the Nazis themselves when they captured the officers and the locality by overrunning this Soviet territory and its concentration camps in August 1941. When the Polish government in London requested an investigation of this crime at the site by the International Red Cross, the Soviet government broke off diplomatic relations with the Sikorsky government on the grounds that it had fallen victim to Nazi propaganda because of anti-Soviet feeling. The Katnya massacres were a subject of controversy for years. Today there is no doubt that the great mass of evidence indicates that these victims, numbering 4,243, met their deaths by being shot through the back of the neck in the early spring of 1940, and not August 1941 or later, when the area was in German possession. This evidence, which clearly indicates Soviet guilt, includes the following points. 1. The victims were wearing the uniforms and boots issued to them at the outbreak of war in 1939, and these were in good condition, showing a minimum of wear, as might be the case in April 1940, but could not have been true in August 1941. 2. All letters, journals, or documents on the bodies had dates previous to May 1940, and in no case later. The victims were arranged in the graves in groups in the same order in which they had been removed from the Soviet concentration camp at Kozalsky in March-April 1940. 4. The victims wrote letters to their families at home up to April 1940, but not later. 5. Letters to victims from their families were delivered by Soviet authorities up to April 1940, but were returned to the centers as undeliverable after that date. 6. In private conversations, various Soviet authorities at various times admitted the murders. There is much other evidence showing Soviet guilt in this affair, but it must not be forgotten that both Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany were determined to exterminate all Polish leaders, and the Polish nation by reducing the leaderless Poles to the status of slave laborers, and that Germany also would have killed these Polish officers if they had captured them, since the Germans did exterminate 4 million Poles in this way during the war. Although the number of bodies at Katnya was less than 5,000, the number of officers murdered was almost twice this figure, the rest, apparently, having been drowned in the White Sea. The crisis in Soviet-Polish relations in the spring of 1943 marks a turning point in the relations of the three great powers fighting Germany. Although every effort was made to conceal this fact at that time, from March 1943 onward, the Soviet authorities did all they could to build up the Union of Polish Patriots as the center of aspirations of the Poles still suffering in their own country, while, at the same time, Washington began to pay the Polish government in exile an annual subsidy of $12.5 million to finance its underground organizations in Poland and its diplomatic relations with Latin American countries. Within Poland itself, the London government soon had a secret army and a secret underground government, including a parliament, schools, and a system of courts. This government met in secret, made decisions, and executed sentences on disloyal Poles, especially on collaborators with the Nazis. Nazi plans aimed at the eventual extermination of the Poles and the Polish nation. In the winter of 1939 to 1940, all Poles were deported, street by street, with only a few hours' notice from the western areas annexed to Germany into the government general. In the latter areas, under the rule of Hans Frank and Arthur Seyss-Inquart, all wealth which could be used by Germany was confiscated and removed. All Polish institutions of higher learning or culture were abolished, so that only elementary schools, and these conducted in the German language, were allowed. All outstanding persons were murdered. Millions were deported westward to work as slave laborers in German factories. The food consumption of those who remained was reduced by German seizure of food supplies to a quarter of the daily need, to 600 calories. And various measures, such as separation of the sexes, were taken to prevent the reproduction of Poles. Under these circumstances, it is remarkable that Polish spirit could not be broken, that hundreds of thousands of Poles continued to resist in guerrilla bands, in the underground Home Army, under Generals Groth, Stefan Rowecki, and Bohr, Thaddeus Komorowski, and that sabotage, propaganda, spying, and communication with the Polish government in London continued to flourish. At the time these events were taking place, the people of the English-speaking world were almost totally ignorant of the diplomatic controversies behind the scenes, and almost equally ignorant of the conditions of life in German-occupied Europe. On the other hand, they were fully aware of the victory in North Africa, of the conquest of Sicily, and of the invasion of Italy. The strategic decisions involved in these campaigns, and above all, the decision of September 1943 to reject Churchill's plans for a Balkan campaign in order to concentrate on the cross-channel offensive for 1944, were of vital importance in setting the form that post-war Europe would take. If the strategic decision of 1943 had been made differently, to postpone the cross-channel attack, and instead to concentrate on an assault from the Aegean across Bulgaria and Romania toward Poland and Slovakia, the post-war situation would have been quite different. This we can say with assurance, even though we cannot say with any certainty what the difference would have been. In the course of 1943, while Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin were still devoting their chief attention to the conduct of the war, their foreign ministers, Cordell Hull, Anthony Eden, and Vyacheslav Molotov, were given increasing attention to planning for post-war problems. The chief of these problems which were discussed were 1. The economic demobilization of the victor powers. 2. The relief and rehabilitation of the defeated countries and of the liberated areas. 3. Problems involving refugees and displaced persons. 4. Problems of finance and of international monetary exchanges. 5. The punishment of war criminals in the defeated states. 6. The forms of government of these states and of the liberated states. 7. Territorial questions such as the boundaries of Germany, of Hungary, or of Poland. 8. The disposition of the colonial possessions, or, as they were called, the dependent areas, of both victors and vanquished. 9. The problem of the post-war political relationships of the victorious states and of the world as a whole. It is evident that many of these problems were of an explosive nature, and could lead to disputes among the Allies and possibly even to a weakening of their joint anti-German efforts. As a consequence, the foreign ministers' discussions of many of these problems were tentative and hesitant, and were frequently interrupted to confer with the three heads of governments. Even on this higher level, agreement could not be reached in some cases, and these problems were generally put aside, lest efforts to reach an agreement alienate the Allies to the detriment of their war efforts against Germany. This was most emphatically true of questions involving the possible post-war situation in Eastern Europe, where the frontiers of Germany, of Poland, and of the Soviet Union, or the status of Poland and of the Baltic states, were far too controversial to be raised except in a most tentative way. It has frequently been argued in recent years that failure to reach any agreement on this territorial and governmental settlement of Eastern Europe while the war was still in progress meant that these questions would tend to be settled by the military situation in existence at the end of the war, with little consideration for questions of legality, humanity, freedom, nationalism, the rights of small states, or other factors which were mentioned so frequently in the Allied wartime propaganda. Specifically, this meant that the Soviet armies would undoubtedly dominate Eastern Europe once Germany was defeated, and that these armies could make a settlement based on force unless the Soviet Union had been compelled, before the complete defeat of Germany, to make agreements with its fellow allies for some more desirable settlement in Eastern Europe. These arguments usually assume that the Soviet Union was reluctant to make an early agreement on this subject, and that it could have been forced to do so because of its need for American supplies during the fighting. This assumption implies that America should have threatened to reduce or to cut off Lend-Lease supplies going to the Soviet Union, unless we could obtain Soviet agreements to the kind of Eastern European settlement we wanted. These arguments are based on hindsight and not on any realistic understanding of the historical facts as they developed. It is now clear from the published documents that the Soviet Union was eager to obtain some early agreement on the Eastern European post-war settlement, and that both the United States and Britain were reluctant to make such an agreement, apparently because of the fear that we could do so only at the price of extensive concessions to Russia, at the expense of the smaller Eastern European states. We were unwilling to use our control of Lend-Lease supplies to force concessions from Russia, because any reduction of such supplies by weakening the Soviet Union's resistance to Germany would increase Germany's ability to fight the Anglo-Americans and would lengthen the war. Moreover, Soviet ideas on the Baltic states and the eastern frontiers of Poland were so rigidly uncompromising that no concessions could have been obtained on these points except perhaps by reducing Lend-Lease shipments to a degree which the Anglo-Americans, in their own interests, were unwilling to do. It was feared that any drastic Anglo-American pressure on Russia in this form would lend to violent protests from the electorate in Britain and in the United States, since the citizens of the two democratic powers were much more concerned with getting on with the war than they were with the post-war situation of the Poles or of the Baltic states. Moreover, the Anglo-American leaders were fearful that if Russia's ability to fight Germany was reduced by any curtailing of supplies, the Soviet leaders might make a separate peace with Hitler, allowing the Nazis to turn the full brunt of their fury westward. Rumors of possible Soviet-Nazi discussions looking toward a separate peace were circulating in London and Washington at various times, particularly in the latter part of 1943. And the Anglo-American leaders were too clearly aware of the sudden Nazi-Soviet agreement of August 1939 to push the Russians so hard that they might make another, more fateful agreement of a similar character. The blunt truth, which was faced by the Anglo-American leaders throughout the war, was that full-scale Soviet resistance to Germany seemed essential if the Nazis were ever to be beaten, and that what seemed at the time to be lesser or more remote considerations had to yield to that fundamental fact. Winston Churchill, in June 1941, had welcomed the Russians as allies against Hitler, with the statement that he would be ready to ally with the devil in hell if the devil was ready to fight Hitler. Naturally, this point of view became less extreme as the defeat of Hitler became less remote. But the Germans fought so well, up to the very end of the war, that it never became possible to force any Soviet concessions in regard to the post-war political settlement in Eastern Europe. Instead, the tactic was adopted wholeheartedly by President Roosevelt, more reluctantly by Prime Minister Churchill, of trying to win the Soviet leaders, especially Stalin, to a less suspicious and more conciliatory mood, by full-scale cooperation in the war and by friendly concessions to the Soviet sensibilities on wider issues. This alternative policy was by no means an easy one, for Soviet suspicions were so close to the surface and Soviet sensibilities were so touchy that cooperation with these people proved to be a very delicate and unpleasant business. It was, however, a business at which Roosevelt was personally adept, and it worked adequately enough until the war with Germany and Roosevelt's life drew to their close together in the spring of 1945. The various post-war problems we have mentioned were discussed at a series of high-level conferences during the war years. At a conference in Washington in March 1943, Eden and Roosevelt agreed that Germany should be broken up into 3 or 4 states after its defeat, but did not see eye to eye on many other matters. Roosevelt felt that only the 4 great powers would need to be armed in the post-war world, and could keep the peace for all other states if they could agree among themselves. Other states, relieved of the burden of armaments, could devote all their resources to economic reconstruction. The 4 great powers would be helped in the task of keeping the peace for all by the joint possession of various strategic points throughout the world, like Dakar or Formosa, and could work together to instruct the public opinion of the world by a joint sponsorship of informational centers scattered about the globe. In such a system, in which lesser states did not have to defend themselves, there could be no objection, in Roosevelt's thinking, to separating peoples, like the Serbs and Krauts, who could not agree, or in providing independence for dependent areas, such as Hong Kong. Most of these made little sense to Eden, who was not prepared to give up Hong Kong, or other portions of the British colonial possessions, or to see the Soviet Union on the borders of a Europe in which all other states were disarmed. The chief areas of agreement at this conference were that Germany should be dismembered after the war, and that Poland could obtain East Prussia. 2 months later, at the so-called Trident Conference in Washington, Churchill and Roosevelt went over the same matters, May 1943. The cross-channel attack, Overlord, was set for May 1944, and an intensified aerial bombardment of Germany ordered as a preliminary. No important decisions could be made on post-war problems, although the atmosphere was brightened by a Soviet announcement of the abolition of the Communist International and an Anglo-American announcement renouncing extraterritorial rights in China. The next conference, held in May and June 1943, at Hot Springs, Virginia, was of a technical nature, and discussed post-war food and agricultural problems. From this conference there emerged a United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, an advisory body to collect and disseminate agricultural information, as had been done previously by the League of Nations affiliate, the International Institute of Agriculture in Rome. Closely related to FAO, but of a temporary rather than permanent character, and possessing administrative rather than simply advisory powers, was the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA. At the first meeting of this international organization, at Atlantic City, New Jersey, in November 1943, 44 nations agreed to contribute 1% of their national incomes to purchase relief supplies for war-devastated peoples. Herbert Lehman, former governor of New York, was elected Director General of the new organization. In the meantime, in August 1943 at Quebec, in what is sometimes called the Quadrant Conference, Churchill and Roosevelt found some time for discussion of post-war policy, although their chief concern was with Italy, with Overlord, and with a new shipment to Overlord consisting of an invasion of southern France from the Mediterranean Sea and up the Rhone Valley. This new invasion, known as Anvil, was to be launched in the summer of 1944. At Quebec, Churchill accepted Roosevelt's post-war projects with considerable reluctance. The Prime Minister felt strongly that the United States and the Soviet Union would be the two giants of the post-war world, and that Britain's best interests lay in building some kind of British sphere of influence in Europe and in Asia as a balance against these two giants. He wished to see two regional associations for these two areas, with Britain in both, the two forming part, if necessary, of some larger worldwide association. It soon became clear that the United States would accept no regional associations of this character, and insisted on a worldwide association of individual countries. The American insistence on no spheres of influence and no settlement of frontiers, while the war was on, like the American insistence that China was a great power, was regarded by the other two allies as childishly unrealistic, and even hypocritical, especially as both Britain and Russia were convinced that the United States was aiming to create American spheres of interest, if not regional associations, in its areas of chief concern, Latin America and the Far East. Churchill had to accept Roosevelt's project for a post-war international organization for fear that resistance of these might lead to a revival of American isolationism following the Second World War, as it happened after 1919. This, above all, Churchill had to prevent, since it would leave Britain facing the Soviet Union with no great power companionship. Accordingly, at Quebec in August 1943, Churchill accepted Hull's draft for a post-war United Nations organization, consisting of 4 great powers and associated lesser powers on a worldwide basis. This meant that Britain was committed to seek support against the Soviet Union from the United States within the United Nations organization, rather than through some tripartite balance of power system with spheres of influence. One important consequence of this British commitment to the American point of view appeared in 1943 with respect to the explosive problem of the Polish frontiers. Britain and Russia reached a tentative agreement to move the whole Polish state westward by wholesale transfers of population, drawing its eastern boundary along the Curzon line, and compensating for this loss of territory in the east by moving its western boundary to the Oder and Nysa rivers. Churchill sincerely felt that this shift would greatly strengthen Poland, since the areas lost in the east to Russia were largely swamps and pine barrens, while the areas to be acquired from Germany in the west were rich in agricultural and mineral resources. This project had to be abandoned, however, when it was rejected by both the United States and Poland. The only agreement which could be reached was an informal one that Poland should obtain East Prussia. In preparation for the forthcoming first meeting of the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, in Tehran, their foreign ministers met in Moscow in October 1943. Russian suggestions to force Turkey into the war or to demand air bases in Sweden were rejected, and it was generally agreed not to dismember Germany after the war, but to force Germans to pay reparations for damages and to undergo punishment for crimes against humanity or international law. It was agreed that a disarmed Germany should be ruled jointly under an inter-allied commission, and that Austria should be re-established as an independent country. The chief achievement of the conference was the signature of a four-nation declaration of the United Nations. This document stated that the signers would continue to cooperate after the war for the organization and maintenance of peace and security. It further promised to create a general international organization based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all peace-loving states and open to membership by all such states. The four powers also promised not to use their armies in the post-war period in the territories of other states, except for the purposes envisaged in this declaration and after joint consultation, and to cooperate together to regulate post-war armaments. This declaration was significant because of the American promise not to relapse into isolation again, and because of the American success in having China accepted, admittedly with reluctance, as a great power. In reporting to a joint session of Congress on the significance of this agreement, Secretary of State Hull voiced that kind of naive idealism which made Churchill squirm. He said, quote, "As the provisions of the four-nation declaration are carried into effect, there will no longer be needed for spheres of influence, for alliances, for balancing of power, or any other kind of special arrangements through which, in the unhappy past, the nations strove to safeguard the security or to promote their interests." Close quote. He went on to point out, as a desirable fact, the questions of boundaries had been left in abeyance until the end of hostilities, as the United States had desired. Just at this time, considerable efforts were being made in the United States to obtain popular commitments against any post-war return to isolationism. On September 7, 1943, a conference of leaders of the Republican Party at Mackinac Island, Michigan, endorsed the hopes for a post-war international organization. 2 weeks later, the Fulbright resolution favoring such an organization passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 360 to 29, and in November a similar expression, the Connolly resolution, was accepted in the United States Senate by a vote of 85 to 5. The Moscow Conference of Foreign Ministers was followed, within a month, by the first meeting of the Big Three, held at Tehran from November 28 to December 1, 1943. Since Russia was not at war with Japan, there was no Chinese representatives at Tehran, and the Anglo-Americans met with these at two separate conferences in Cairo before and after the sessions in Tehran, November 22nd through the 26th, and December 3rd through the 6th, 1943. Although the war against China was being fought quite independently from the war against Germany, the Cairo discussions formed a background for the Tehran negotiations and undoubtedly influenced them. Once again, this influence was exerted through strategic discussions. Originally, American strategy against Japan had, under General MacArthur's influence, given a major role to the Army with supporting roles for the Navy and Air Force. This earlier strategy had taken a form known as island hopping, and envisaged a major role for China and the Chinese Army. This strategy intended to approach Japan from Australia, island by island, landing on each and wiping out the Japanese garrisons on each before going on to the next. Eventually, this method would have brought the American Army into contact with China, both across Burma into the southwestern provinces, and also along the southeastern coast at the traditional points of entry to China, at Hong Kong and Canton. Once contact with China had been made in this way, the final assault on Japan would be made by using Chinese forces and Chinese bases as major elements in this final assault. Just as the Tehran Conference was meeting, This Far East strategy was being modified as a result of three factors. In the first place, the success of the United States Navy, with carrier-based planes and with amphibious landing operations, was showing that an attack on Japan could be made directly from the open Pacific without any need to recapture many of Japan's island bases beyond those which were needed as bases for our own Air Force attacks on Japan, and that this could be done without any preliminary contact with the Chinese mainland. At the same time, it was becoming increasingly clear that the Chinese regime of Chiang Kai-shek was hopelessly corrupt and non-combative, and could contribute little or nothing to the final assault on Japan's home islands, or even to the elimination of the large Japanese forces on the Asiatic mainland.